Well, good morning, everybody. I want to start off today by just talking a bit about the pattern we're currently in and we're stuck in, I think, through the end of May and then possibly the first 5 to 7 days of June. What I'm showing you right now is the next 10 days of average temperature anomalies. And what you see here as you look down on the North Pole is that we kind of have a lot of heat that's moved its way pretty far to the north compared to average. So about the only place that's pretty far to the north that's cold right now is just kind of maybe sections of Alaska and parts of Greenland. Now, what I want to show you with this is that wherever you have this heat, the jet stream is going to have to bulge to the north. So we're going to have ridges in each of these places here. And where there'll be troughs, they'll be kind of in the middle. So something like this. So what this is really doing is this is putting a lot of heat north, keeping some cooler air like pretty far to the south here. And this just sets up a very, very weak temperature gradient from the pole to the equator. So from here outward, any which direction you go. So the net effect of this, by having so much warmth north, is that we've just robbed all of the northern hemisphere of its momentum. See, the jet stream is a result of the temperature gradient from the equator to the pole. And what we've got right now is a weaker gradient, which means there's no reason for using the thermal wind relationship, for the heights to change considerably as you ascend in the atmosphere, and therefore nothing to kind of push the wind along. So what this ends up doing is it gives us a pattern that looks something like this. So we have these long waves. There's the first ridge, the second ridge, the third, and the fourth. And the troughs are pretty far to the south, and they're not really truly connected to deep cold air. But this brings flow into the United States like this, and it exits like this. So what this particular feature does in spring is it keeps the plains very, very wet. It keeps parts of the interior mountains wet, but it makes the midsection of the country to the Canadian prairie dry. And we get convergent flow on the back side of this, which keeps the East Coast overall drier. And that's the setup we're in. And it's going to take a while for us to kind of break away from this because we have to wait until the atmosphere is able to regain all that momentum in order to bring the precipitation back. So to distill this down, here is the probability of getting less than a half inch of precipitation for the next 10 days. So everywhere there's white, we expect there to be more precipitation. So again, it's where the trough comes in here in the mountains. It's where the storms pop on the lee side of the Rockies. But where we have that convergent flow aloft, we just have the risk of being drier. There's also lows that keep coming out of Florida. I'm watching one very carefully that's going to try to curl into North Carolina later this week. But I'll flip this over and I'll show you the wet side of it. This is the probability of getting at least an inch of precipitation out of this. And here's 2 inches. So now we can kind of gain some better perspective on how this whole setup is going to be as we finish May and start the month of June. And the concern here is that we have some drier regions that are expected to stay drier. And if the pattern does not break by the time we get into maybe the second week of June, then we start to really run the risk of having some significant yield potential loss in some of the crop. But we're going to talk more about that in our Thursday night in-depth update, what the new long-range outlook is for the middle of June. So right now, we're just going to keep focused on the pattern we're in currently. Over the last 7 days, this is where we've had our wettest conditions. And you can see that in the last week, there's kind of a hole right in through here and another one right in through there that has not measured much precipitation. I should extend that into, of course, Michigan, and there's pockets elsewhere that have missed out on this rainfall too. But the southeast and then the plains, just lots and lots and lots of storms here. And then storms building throughout the mountains into the Pacific Northwest, including the rain that went through and really helped with the firefighting effort in British Columbia and Alberta, which is just off this screen. But if you look at just the precipitation from last night, we're kind of just identifying where we had our storms. And can you kind of see the difference between the shape on this particular image between the storms that have ripped through here, ones in the northern plains, and then down here in Colorado through the southern plains, southeast, versus this? There's quite a bit of colder air coming at this. This is more stratiform rain that came through this area. So see how much smoother it is? This is convection versus stratiform rain. And the difference here is that this is behind along a front that's going to come through and knock these temperatures way back. I'll show you that in just a few moments. But first, I do want to show you the latest satellite imagery as the sun was coming up this morning. There's the front. Look at all the big shallow cumulus air mass here that actually fills itself in. This is a fog this morning here, but there's the front we're going to be talking about in a few moments. And you can still see the smoke from the Canadian wildfires here. In fact, yesterday, if I take you back, we can see all of that smoke tucked away inside the plains, getting into the Midwest and the Great Lakes in New England. But notice there were some big storms that popped yesterday on this heat. So if we just kind of roll this through, look at Texas, look right up the front range of the Rockies in Montana, large storms in Montana, and some big ones that popped here in North Dakota and northern Minnesota. Also adds a lot of convection down into Florida, and storms even as far west as just this side of the Sierra Nevada mountains. So I want to show you those storms in Texas, though. So I'm going to look at some radar imagery. Now, because there's weak upper level flow, storms have a little bit more difficult time spinning. They start off initially as cellular convection, but with almost unidirectional wind shear, very weak wind shear, they tend to just pool around their own outflow. In other words, the new updrafts just kind of form on the gathering together of the outflow of the original. And you can actually see some of those outflow boundaries. You see all these little lines in through here? This is just flow coming out of the storm. It's cold, it's downdraft air. Look at that one right there. And the storms just tend to ride along that. And so this turned into, what we call a squall line, or a mesoscale convective system. There it is again. And went across and did do some damage. So we look at those storm reports from last night. There were 3 reports of tornadoes, as we see the red dots, but mostly wind and hail out of this as it just progressed toward the south and east. Now for the next 3 days, the plains, Florida, and parts of the Pacific Northwest, but getting here into Idaho, Montana, that's where the storms are going to be. So this is today's threat of severe weather. Tomorrow, it's the same corridors. And then we get into Thursday, it's the same corridors. That's not changing much throughout the rest of this week. Or excuse me, this would be all the way to Friday here. So let's go have a look at it in our high-res NAM model. So we pick this up. There's the complex of storms rolling through. We just see the front sagging here through parts of New England. Possibly some isolated scattered shower events here, which would be needed in parts of Missouri. But overall, we just see storms going where storms have been. And that's just the case all the way out here. So Montana stays active. The whole of the front range of the Rocky Mountains here, getting out into the first few hundred miles of the prairie and plains. But there's big high pressure cells sitting here over the Great Lakes, and that's going to be one that brings in some colder air later on this week. So we're not going to step through all the models today because the recipe is the same. You see where it's been wet, it's going to stay wet. The one thing I will be watching later this week is for this moisture to curl around and deliver some much needed rain into Virginia and North Carolina. This is an area that had been drier throughout much of this month, especially the western side of both of those states, so we need that. But overall, it's wettest here, and it's wettest in Montana, stretching into the Canadian prairie when the storms get to that region. Now, as we just go out there to day 10 and beyond, we're just looking for anything that could move this ridge, and that's where all the heat is going to be underneath it. So as we kind of play this forward, what we notice is that the models keep trying to push the ridge back over the Rocky Mountains. Now, at some point in June, this flow, remember we just follow the contours here, that flow sets up a lot of active thunderstorms, but you've got to get fully into the summer regime where there's tons of moisture coming in under this, and get some storms to spark on this and just get pushed downwind, just like you saw last night coming through Texas. That was kind of born on some northwest flow. We need that to expand farther to the north and then get these storms to pull through the eastern Corn Belt over into the southeast. But as it stands, this flow pattern produces a lot of convergence in the upper levels atmosphere. I know you've heard me say that 1,000 times, but that's what we've got here at the end of spring in this particular pattern. This prevents California from seeing extreme heat. This keeps much of the west cooler than it could be and wetter than it could be. And that's why when we look out there to week 2, that whole region has the wet bias. The driest conditions, the CPC's been on top of this, so is the GFS and the European here, GFS there, and that's where we stand. Now, I keep mentioning this cold front coming through, and right now the National Weather Service has issued frost advisories and a freeze warning for parts of northern Wisconsin getting into lower Michigan here. And if we just look over the next 7 days at where we could have a frost, we're going to look at the timing of this event as it comes through. All of this is at high elevation. So let's go right to our minimum temperatures. Here's Wednesday morning's temperatures and Thursday morning. Maximum, I'm sorry. There's my minimum temperatures. So there's Wednesday morning. Here is Thursday morning. That's when the front clears. The skies, are also calm with high pressure, and we've got just a bottoming out of the temperatures with strong radiational cooling. Meanwhile, this is the warmth that's going to pile into this area very soon with overnight lows well into the 60s in North Dakota. So this is Friday morning lows, getting into Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. What are those high temperatures doing? Let's come back to it now. Here's Thursday's highs, getting into Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Now I played it fast because where you see the colder air, it's here, it's there, and it's there. I say colder relative to normal. So notice it is 88 down here in Houston, and it is 88 here in Sioux Falls. And so without a temperature gradient, there's nothing to drive the strong winds. And that's why this spring has actually not been nearly as windy, at least the second half of it, as we had seen in the last couple of years. Okay, now let's go to the next 7 days of GDDs. So we do expect quite a bit of heat to be piling into this area. Some temperatures may crack 90 degrees here pretty soon, and that's going to give us a really rapid accumulation of some GDDs. But if you also factor in how hot and dry it's going to be, we see these evaporation rates here coming up above 2 inches in a week. So this is going to cause some issues here with pretty quickly depleted moisture levels in both the new crop and in the soil. So this is just continuing to increase the what will end up being a pretty desperate need for rain once we get into the middle of June on this crop. Last couple things here I want to show you. This is the latest 15-day outlook on temperatures. We can play this relatively quickly because overall it's got the same story. And it takes you all the way out. There it is to June 2nd through the 7th right there. Finally, I do want to show you the latest updates from the Climate Prediction Center. They released these again yesterday. There's a slight risk for excessive heat in this part of the Corn Belt once we get out to the end of the month in the first 2 days of June. And if we look on the precipitation side, it's got a moderate risk of having heavy rain, out there at that same time period for this part of Texas. So last year when we were talking about extreme heat, already 100-degree temperatures in Texas, and drought developing, this year we've made a complete flip on that particular pattern. So important just to continue to stress that. Lastly, we have some international weather just to discuss briefly. Spain, while it's cool now, we've taken a look recently at the NDVI imagery. It's the lowest it's been in 20 years, but you can see the heat coming through Europe. It's also here in Russia. And overall, relatively warm throughout much of South America. But notice we're quite cool in the northern part of India, and the Manchurian and North China Plain are quite cool as well. Australia's temperature is going back toward normal after being quite cool for a while. On the precipitation side of things, do note that rain is forecast to come into southern Brazil. And that rain coming into southern Brazil is absolutely critical to the safrinha crop, which needs this extra drink to finish off things in the like Mato Grosso do Sul, getting over toward like Goiás and Paraná. Finally, look at Spain, finally getting the rain that it desperately needs, but it needed this for the last 3 months. But we'll see if this improves some of the conditions of the crop there. All right, we'll stop it here, and we'll talk to you again tomorrow morning. Thanks.